what is BlackBerry today?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, because that's we get it all the time.
Physical device. You remember those? They were awesome. The battery lasted like a week.
In 2007, one company controlled almost half of the American smartphone market and was the most valuable company in all of Canada. Today, you can't even buy a new phone with its name on it. This is the story of how the company that invented the smartphone as we know it convinced itself it couldn't be beaten right up until it was. This video covers the entire arc of BlackBerry, the rise that made it a verb, the fall that turned it into a cautionary tale, and the quieter, stranger second act the company is living through right now, one you've probably never heard about. It starts in 1984 in Waterloo, Canada, when two engineering students, Mike Lazaridis and Douglas Fregan, founded a small company called Research in Motion. Nobody in that garage-sized operation was dreaming about smartphones yet. They were just obsessed with wireless data. But that obsession, over the next 2 decades, would build one of the most dominant tech products of its era, and then lose almost everything to a company that wasn't even in the phone business yet. This isn't really a story about a phone. It's a story about what happens when the company that defines an industry stops believing the industry can change. Here's how a couple of Canadian engineering students built a device that half of corporate America couldn't put down. Research in Motion spent its first decade as a quiet player in wireless paging, the unglamorous plumbing of the mobile world. That changed in 1999 with the launch of the RIM 950, a chunky two-way pager with a tiny keyboard and a feature that felt like magic at the time. It pushed email straight to your hand, no dial-up, no syncing, just there. The RIM 957 followed, refining the formula, and by the early 2000s, the word BlackBerry had stopped meaning a fruit and started meaning a lifestyle. Executives, lawyers, and politicians became visibly, almost helplessly attached to their devices. The press gave it a nickname that stuck: the CrackBerry. It wasn't marketing hype. It was a real, observable addiction to instant email, and RIM leaned into it with a strategy most consumer tech companies of the era ignored completely. Instead of chasing everyday shoppers, BlackBerry went straight for IT departments and enterprise contracts, embedding itself so deeply into corporate infrastructure that switching away felt organizationally painful. The physical keyboard wasn't a compromise either. It was the entire pitch. Thumb typing on a BlackBerry was fast, tactile, and, to its users, simply superior to anything else on the market. Add BBM, the encrypted messaging platform that turned BlackBerry ownership into its own private social network, and the product basically sold itself. The numbers backed up the mythology. At its peak, BlackBerry commanded roughly 43% of the U.S. smartphone market and around 20% globally. Revenue hit close to $20 billion in a single fiscal year. And in 2007, Research in Motion briefly became the most valuable company in Canada. It wasn't just a good business, it was, for a moment, one of the best businesses on the planet. Then, in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco holding a slab of glass with no keyboard at all. The reaction inside RIM wasn't panic, it was disbelief. Mike Lazaridis reportedly looked at the iPhone's early battery life and browsing demands and said, essentially, that building a phone doing all that on a single cellular network was an impossibility. He wasn't wrong about the engineering difficulty. He was wrong about everything else.
Good morning.
That single moment is the hinge
Yes, I'd
of
like
this
to order
entire
4,000
story.
lattes to go, please. No, just kidding. Wrong number. Thank you.
not because RIM's leadership was foolish. They were, by any measure, brilliant engineers, but because they judged Apple's phone by BlackBerry's own rulebook. Battery efficiency, network load, enterprise security. Apple wasn't playing that game. It was building a computer that happened to make calls and betting that consumers would rewrite the rules around what a phone was supposed to be for.
BlackBerry didn't ignore the threat, it just kept answering the wrong question. The BlackBerry Storm, released in 2008 as its first touchscreen response, was rushed and glitchy, and it damaged the brand more than it helped. The Torch tried to split the difference between keyboard and touchscreen and satisfied almost nobody. Years later, the Z10 arrived with a genuinely new operating system, BlackBerry 10, built in part on QNX, a real-time operating system RIM had acquired, but by then, developers had already voted with their feet. That's really where the wound became fatal, not one bad phone, but a slow-motion collapse of the app ecosystem. Users left because the apps weren't there. Developers didn't build the apps because the users were leaving. It became a destructive feedback loop, one BlackBerry never found a way to break. And the deeper problem wasn't visible in any single product, it was cultural. A company that had spent a decade optimizing for security and battery life had built an organization that moved in years, right as the industry started moving in months.
And Hines, he's the president and CEO of BlackBerry. Mr. Hines, welcome. Good to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
By 2011, BlackBerry had shipped around 50 million phones. 2 years later, that number had cratered to under 30 million, and global market share had slid from roughly 20% down towards single digits. The company that once dictated enterprise IT policy was now fighting to stay relevant to it. The leadership departures told their own story. In January 2012, co-CEOs Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie both stepped down, replaced by Thorsten Hines, a changeover that came far too late to change the trajectory. Layoffs followed in waves, thousands of jobs at a time, in a city, Waterloo, that had built much of its identity around the company. By late 2013, the board brought in John Chen, a turnaround specialist with a track record of rescuing struggling tech firms. His task wasn't to save the phone business, it was to figure out what BlackBerry could be once the phone business was gone. Under Chen, BlackBerry did something few people expected. It survived by becoming almost unrecognizable. The company doubled down on the QNX operating system, which quietly became the software running inside the infotainment and safety systems of hundreds of millions of vehicles. It acquired Silence, an AI-driven cybersecurity firm, and Good Technology, an enterprise mobility company, stitching together a new identity as a security and software business rather than a hardware one. Then, in January 2022, BlackBerry pulled the plug on its own history, shutting down network services for the classic BlackBerry OS devices, the very phones that had built the brand. The keyboards that once ruled boardrooms simply stopped working. It was a quiet death for a product that had once felt unkillable, and a fitting final image for how the story of hardware BlackBerry actually ended. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with someone, somewhere, finally switching off the servers. BlackBerry, as most people remember it, doesn't exist anymore. But the company does, and it's bigger in some ways than it ever was as a phone maker. Today, it operates as a cybersecurity and automotive software company, with QNX code running inside a huge share of the world's connected cars. You've probably interacted with BlackBerry's engineering more recently than you think, just not through anything with a keyboard. The lesson underneath all of it isn't really about phones. It's about how being right at something, even spectacularly right, can convince a company that the rules it mastered are the only rules that matter. BlackBerry didn't lose because it stopped innovating.
It lost because it kept innovating inside a box that the rest of the industry had already stepped outside of. So the real question isn't what happened to BlackBerry. It's which company right now is making the exact same mistake and doesn't know it yet.